Hi, this is ZGross and ACarlin for our writings final part two. And we are answering the question, how should Christians think about people of other nations immigrating to their country? And we chose Esther and Daniel as our books. So we're going to discuss how those two books help us answer that question.
Perfect.
Perfect. So the first point that I saw that was relevant was the idea of how immigrants are seen as they enter a host culture or a different culture, and the way that their differences in any way lead them to be ostracized, maybe feared or judged. The way I saw this in Esther was in chapter 3, when Haman finds out that Mordecai's a Jew. He says that there's one ethnic group that's scattered throughout the peoples in every province, keeping themselves separate, and their laws are different from everyone else's. They do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. And just this idea of, because they have different practices and customs, Mordecai Haman thinks, man, these guys, they're different. We should get rid of them because they're different, essentially.
Right. And of course, the same thing in Daniel with the foods in chapter 1, the religious practices in chapter 3 and chapter 6. And one of the things, if we just zoom out for just a second to think about, okay, how does exile, is it similar to immigration? Because a lot of times I think, and certainly we see in both of these books, how the people ended up in their new culture as exiles. But when we think about immigration, do we think about, gosh, how did these people get here, right? Maybe it wasn't, they just came because they wanted to, and so they should live the way that we want them to live. Maybe they didn't have a choice, maybe they were forced, or maybe their circumstances were so untenable that it wasn't really a choice. And so when we think about like how Christians should think about people of other nations immigrating, I think we should start with, what is the backstory, right? How did they come to be here? And not start with, oh, how are they different? Why is it that they do these weird things that look different to us? And that also this idea of assimilation, right? Of like, just because you are the person who's come here, does that automatically assume that you should become like us, right? And the difference between, certainly in the culture of Esther and Daniel, that was the assumption, right? Like, we're bringing you here because we want you to be like us, and then go back and convince other people to be like us too, right? But is that as a believer today, do I have that sort of rooted in me without even realizing that that's what I'm doing? Like, we've talked in other classes too about Christianity lumped in with culture as well, right? Is it contextualized to what they could understand and practice versus, okay, well, no, you're going to be a Christian and you're going to wear a suit and you're going to sit in a pew, that kind of stuff. So I think there was a lot of overlap for sure in that one. And then the other thing that I noted, talking about the judgment and the fear and being set apart, and it kind of goes off on a little bit of a tangent, is the idea of what immigrants' roles in our community, like how are they serving, how are they functioning? And Daniel, he was a young man, and I'm going to save this one for later because there's another point that also speaks to this one. So we can move on.
I thought a natural transition then was on the idea of scarcity.
Yes.
The idea that there's not enough to go around, and that's also another reason that people have to immigrate, because in their culture there literally is not enough to go around, whether that's because of a natural disaster or government misusing those resources. The fact is, in their situation, there's not enough, and so then that's why they are seeking somewhere where there seems to be enough, which ironically is one of the reasons that people don't want immigrants coming into their own country, is that they don't think that there is enough. And I think the picture we get, certainly in Esther and absolutely in Daniel, is that God is sovereign over this world, and there certainly is an abundance of natural resources if and only if they're not misused by really, really powerful, prideful people who think that it's just for them and their benefit and their pomp and celebrating their greatness. if those resources are used wisely, there's more than enough. And so I think as Christians, if we trust in God's sovereignty, if we trust in his good rule over his creation, and the rise and the fall of kingdoms, and that certainly extends to natural resources, and understanding that there can be enough, there is enough, and to not allow someone to come into your country for fear of not there being enough doesn't seem to be a trust in God's sovereignty in that situation.
Absolutely, for sure. And I've just, as you were speaking, I was like, oh, that's Haman 100%, right? Like, gotta get it, gotta keep it. And that was also the advisors in Daniel 6, where they were like, okay, Daniel's been put in this position of power. And not only is it, oh, good, we have a competent person in a position of power, it's, oh, how do we get him out of there, right? This idea, there's not enough, so I've got to get mine. And just looking at one of the things that I was thinking about is, do we honor the way that immigrants serve in our country, right? Because Mordecai was serving, Daniel and his friends were serving, and they were doing it well enough that they were being recognized. And instead of looking at them as a threat to, what it is that I want, how do we honor that? And I also think, and this sort of plays into the pride that we were talking about just before we started recording about, people's positions in society. Do I honor them if they're succeeding, but do I also honor them if they're doing the things that nobody else wants to do? What we would think about, like, oh, the sort of more menial jobs, the lower jobs on the totem pole. And like Daniel and his friends, the things that they were doing. And Daniel, he goes through the whole, like, multiple kings, like he's got a lifetime of serving consistently. And I think Mordecai too, of just, being a consistent presence, even though it was difficult. And do we look at that and honor that level of commitment and effort in a place that isn't their original country or culture, instead of going, oh, I can't believe you do that job, or I don't want you doing that job because I want it, or I want the recognition that comes from it. So I think it goes both, right, on both ends of the spectrum, which I think we see in both. And for sure, sovereignty, right? If we don't trust, then we have to manage ourselves. Just looking at my little notes. Oh, and then the other thing, and we saw, I don't know if you watched the Esther movie that was optional. We saw it sort of portrayed a little bit that way. There were a couple of scenes about how they behaved at home, and then what they had to do when they went out into society. And Daniel too, for sure, about like what they're called when he would go and pray. No, he didn't shut the windows, but he was at home. He wasn't, out publicly. Do we view people differently and think about how, are we expecting them to change everything about themselves, including what they do at home, versus how are they integrating in society? And there's so much about, like I said, about pride, right? And are we assuming rightness? Are we assuming, oh, you have to change? And as Christians, we have such an opportunity, I think, to be gracious and welcoming before there's any discussion of, change. And not only that, but what about trying to understand? Hey, tell me more about your, whatever it is, not in a way that's, I think it's a slippery slope with some people when you say something like that. I don't mean tell me more about your religious practices so I could participate, but tell me more about your culture. Tell me more about your family traditions. Tell me more about why it is that you do some of these things, so that we have a position or, a place of understanding before we get to anything about whether it's right or not.
Yeah. And what you were just saying there made me think of just one example of that being names. Names are so important. Names are part of your identity. And in both Esther and in Daniel, we see it's really obvious with Daniel and his 4 friends. We get the chapter where it says they're renamed. Esther, we get both of her names, and then Mordecai doesn't have an Israelite name, so we would assume either his name was changed in his lifetime, or he was just given that because he was already an immigrant. And just thinking about people that I've come into contact with, there was a large population of Asian students at my high school, and so many of them had a lot of them, wanted an American name because they wanted to fit in.
Mhm.
And what makes them feel like they need to do that? Is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? I don't know if I would speak as much on that. But then there were others who hadn't picked one or hadn't decided if they wanted to do that, and the teachers would just like assign it, and it feels very
Oh,
similar to this.
uh-huh.
There was one teacher that just like started naming them, Peter 1 and Peter 2, and it's just like, oh, that feels so King
Mm.
Belshazzar, and like that's,
Yes.
I'm just making those connections now. It's like, do we need them? Do we need everything about them to sound like us, including their name, their identity, who they are?
Mhm.
Or are we willing to let that be something that we have to figure out how to pronounce and be a little bit
Right.
of inconvenienced?
Yeah, put in the effort to figure out how to say it, which I think, the larger pool that fits in is this idea of language, right? Like the assumption of judgment about, if someone doesn't speak a language immediately or well. I have a friend who's Brazilian and she's been here a while, and she speaks much better English than I speak Brazilian. But she just a couple of weeks ago was telling me about some stuff that had happened at her kids' high school and how the administration had been very unkind to her and suggested that, long story short, they were considering not letting some of her kids pass, because they were asking for notes and permissions and all this stuff, which she had provided. And the implication was, because you're not from here, you don't speak English well enough, you don't understand what we're asking for. And she's like, oh no, I understand, and I've provided it. And we were talking about it, and it just made me so frustrated, because I thought, if I had walked in and said that, oh, no problem, Mrs. Carlin. Right. But I certainly don't speak Brazilian or Portuguese. Oh my gosh, I sound so ignorant. Portuguese. I need to drink some of my coffee. Brazilians speak Portuguese. Yes, I do know that. But anyway, back to Daniel and Esther. In Daniel, the structural, like, part of the message was in Hebrew and part of it was Aramaic. And this idea of you can have both depending on who the message is trying to get to. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And as Christians thinking about how we communicate, are we willing to try to communicate in a way that is possible for both people to understand? It might not be convenient, to your point. We might have to put in a little more effort. We might have to look a little bit silly and be willing to try. But I think that's a really good opportunity for us to be honoring and respectful, and not just assume, oh, you came here, so you need to get in line.
Yeah. Another point that I hit on was the idea of retribution theology. And that seems pretty blatant in both of these books. In, like, first example that comes to mind is Haman being hung on his own gallows. But it's certainly pretty clear in the kings in Daniel, when they are prideful, they get humbled, they pray immediately. And I think obviously we can't oversimplify that. We know from the larger biblical story that it's not so black and white and simple. But for this assignment, taking these two books, it seems like a pretty intense warning that that we're supposed to care for the immigrant and the orphan and the widow. And so if we're not, then according to retribution theology, we're heaping up this judgment. And I think we can't, even with our perspective of knowing that that's simplified, I don't think that should change anything about the way that we should still want to live rightly, and still know that there is a relationship between how we treat other people and then how we will be treated.
Absolutely. And to watch out for our own pride, right? And whether it's conscious or unconscious, the assumptions that we're making about other people, because solely based on where they're from or what their circumstances are. And I think then the natural extension of that is that what we miss out on, right? If I'm, number one, I don't want the judgment, but also what opportunities are we missing out on by not recognizing circumstances from a humble perspective, right? Wow, look at what you have to offer. And I think there's so much in immigration. Oh, I have a dog scratching at my office door. You can come in. There's so much of this idea of what we, and I say we, what the host culture can offer the immigrant versus not recognizing what the immigrant, or the exile in this case, can offer the host culture. And I think that's super important. Hello. Which sort of leads into this idea of what you were talking about, being in a place for a purpose and having that opportunity. So I'll let you speak to that, or
yeah,
whatever.
Perfect. That's exactly where I was going to go with it too. So I think just the really important takeaway for myself, probably the biggest takeaway, was this idea that Esther has is encouraged by Mordecai to consider that maybe she is in the place that she's in for a reason, for this time, this period. And I was thinking about myself and about Christians in specifically the United States, and how we have opportunities, and we live in a democracy where we get to vote, and I live in Southern California, where we have a lot of immigrants. And so just the idea that maybe I'm here doing, in school studying this right now because there's an opportunity for me, because I have a call to have eyes open and be ready for that. And I think to not worry about it and think, well, somebody else will take care of it. God's got this. It's God's sovereignty, would be to remove the part where, well, who does God work through? God works through people, his covenant people, in positions. And one, I'll miss out on what he wants to do through me. And two, I think there'll be accountability for why I didn't act when I had an opportunity.
For sure. And I think, oh my gosh, Daniel, right? His 3 friends standing up to the king going, we don't have to explain ourselves. We're going to do this. And how much easier would it have been to just be like, somebody else can stand up. I don't need to do that. Or, Daniel could have closed the windows instead of praying. And just this idea that they were there and they knew that regardless of what happened to them, that they had an obligation is too strong of a word, an opportunity, and maybe it's not too strong a word, but it's not quite the word I mean when I like our context of what that means, of like, wow, this is what God has called us to do. Circumstances don't look like the way I wish I had an opportunity to demonstrate this principle, right? But I'm going to do it anyway because it is part of my role as a follower of, in their case, Yahweh. And for us as Christians, I think about, how many times have there been situations where I could have stood up and said, you know what, that's not okay. It's not okay to do that. It's not okay to speak to somebody that way. It's not okay to treat somebody that way. Or less aggressively, like, oh, here's an opportunity where I can provide something that somebody needs. And just like, it doesn't always have to be, a big in the face of an angry person opportunity. It can be just, oh, there is a lot of need. And like you said, if I have my eyes open, I will see it. And am I willing to do that? Which I think is really nice about leading into the other two of the other things you said about Esther using any means necessary and God rescuing the oppressed. So whichever direction you want to go.
Cool. I think we're over time.
Oh, look at us.
By a lot.
Oh, by a lot?
Yeah, like 1830.
Okay. Well, Professor Nate, we had a lot to say about this.
We sure did.
I love it. Well, I think, at least from my side, I think we hit on sovereignty, pride, language, roles in the community, retribution theology, scarcity, abundance. There was a whole lot in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great parallels from these books.
Indeed. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about them.
Yeah. Thank you. All right.